Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be here. I think as I was preparing for this presentation, I found, and hopefully I'm gonna hit the right button to the side. Yeah, I found that my inspiration was actually coming from this person, Hillary Clinton. I don't know how many of you guys remember her, or maybe you forgot about her, but now she's back in the news because she wrote a book to explain what she thinks happened over the last election. And I found it really, really interesting because now Hillary's finally opening up and telling people what she really thinks, right? And so what she said, and I really identified with this quote, she said, "It's difficult for me to see my story as one of revolution, but I was part of the women's movement that led to a revolution, not just in laws, but in attitudes and doors that have been closed to young women opening. I'm grateful for that, but I'm also conscious of the continuing double standard. I have to be better than everyone. I have to work harder. There's no margin for me when others have so much leeway. It's a pressure cooker all the time. I try to pull that curtain back so young dynamic women like America Ferrera, in this case, can see themselves in historic context and know they can overcome the obstacles in their way." And I found that really, really interesting because beyond the kind of issue of gender, we of course have, in the case of tech, a lot of, or a lack of diversity in the case of Silicon Valley, in the case of the UK as well. So I don't know how many of you guys have been following the story about kind of, people basically saying that there's no diversity in tech, but that's because of biological reasons or other reasons. And so you have a lot of the big tech companies actually having fewer than 2% of their workforce, in some cases being, for example, African American in the United States, even though African Americans make up about 13% of the population. And so I really identify with this because, as they say sometimes at Telefonica in Spain, I cover all of the diversity boxes. I'm black, I'm a gay man, I grew up in New York after immigrating from Jamaica, so I was an immigrant, and we grew up in the Bronx. So every kind of burden you think you could possibly have, I think I was able to hopefully overcome. And I think it's because I had like a strong family, and this is what my mother actually just sent me right before I came here, because I was saying, oh, there's potentially a new opportunity at Telefonica. I really think I want to go for it, but it's like really tough. And she told me something that my aunt always told me when I was growing up. Remember, you're a Stewart. You're as good as any, better than many, and inferior to none. And in my particular case, that meant that I was able to then kind of, usually not fully believing in myself, but having enough people pushing me forward so that I was actually able to do some kind of interesting things like go to Yale College or Yale Law School or create my own startup, which we sold later for about $4 million, or become a business school professor at IE Business School, and now to run something called WIRA, which is Telefonica's accelerator program. And WIRA is doing pretty well for itself. I mean, according to some polls, it's the best accelerator in the UK, both because of business development numbers and because of follow-on funding. In particular, if we look at how much money our startups have raised, they've raised about 150 million over the last few years. And more importantly for us, they're doing a lot of work with Telefonica, in this case, 100 pilots and trials that have been worth about $8 million for the startups. But even though we kind of get like a lot of really cool people coming into the space and saying entrepreneurship is really important, and we get to meet other really cool people in places like Buckingham Palace, I still realized that there wasn't really that much diversity. There weren't that many people who looked like me or the people that I grew up with when I was helping to accelerate startups in WIRA. So this is why a few years back we launched something called Startup DNA. And we basically asked all of our partners around the country to help us identify who exactly made up the startup ecosystem. And so it depended on who was reading the data. People took it certain ways. So some people said, well, London is a lot more diverse than the US in terms of tech, which is definitely the case. But it's also the case that just as in the US, the vast majority of entrepreneurs were still overwhelmingly white, male, and upper class, and women were far less likely to get funded than men. And my question always has been, well, if we're dealing with a sector where people are talking about computers someday taking over, artificial intelligence, and they're going to take all of our jobs, why can't we figure out how to just deal with some of the simpler issues like racism, sexism, homophobism, classism, etc.? It shouldn't be more difficult than teaching a computer to learn for itself, right? It just seems to me that a lot of times there's just not the will or the real desire to kind of get those sorts of things done. And this came clear to me again in this article that I saw in The Guardian when they kind of looked at Silicon Valley's tech problem, the one that I showed you before, and they said, but if you compare Silicon Valley, for example, to Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. has about 17% of its high-tech workers being, in that particular case, African American. And it was simply the case that there was a real commitment on the part of the government and the universities and all of the ecosystem to really try and support diversity in entrepreneurship, particularly in that case in the African American community. And that was the only reason why it happened. It didn't happen because all of a sudden there was a kind of greater concentration of brilliant people in Washington, D.C., and because of people making real efforts to actually try to make that difference. And I see this happening not only in tech, but in other sports or in other arenas as well. So if you look, for example, to tennis, the USTA, the U.S. Tennis Association, makes great efforts to make sure that it's tapping into the next Serena Williams and Venus Williams, et cetera, et cetera. They don't just simply wait for people to come and say, oh, well, black people can't play tennis. They actually kind of go and say, okay, well, let's convince people to learn how to play tennis. And once we detect someone with talent, let's kind of cultivate that talent. And that's how you find a Serena Williams, or in this case, a Sloane Stephens or a Madison Keys, who were the 2 finalists in the most recent U.S. Open. Same thing with football. We see that would be the case. Even president of the United States. You can be president of the United States, but apparently you can't really kind of make that much headway in tech if you belong to certain groups. Right? And we also found that this wasn't only a question of race or gender and these other things. One of the other things that we found really, well, at least surprising for me, because as you can tell by the accent, I'm American, is that there was also a lack of geographical diversity. So most of the money, even though the UK is probably the 3rd most important tech ecosystem in the world behind the US and probably then only Israel, it's also the case that the vast majority of the money invested is invested in London. And when we're talking about London, we're not even talking about all of London. We're talking about Zone 1 and Zone 2 of London. That's where you have all of the incubators, accelerators, and co-working spaces. And this is actually a report that the mayor's office, when it was under Boris Johnson, did to kind of show the strength of London as a startup ecosystem, which is great. But then you can read the information the other way and say, but what about everybody else? And so what we think, and after we read all of the data, is if you're not part of the problem, the solution, then you're part of the problem. Because a lot of times at a lot of conferences, all we do is sit around and talk about the problems, and people have been talking about this ever since I was a young person, which increasingly was a very long time ago. So then it's kind of like, well, what's next? What can we do more than talk about it? And so that was what we tried to focus on. So then we made a pledge that we were going to try and build new spaces outside of our London office. And so we said our goal was to democratize entrepreneurship, to make it open and accessible to everyone. So we opened up spaces all throughout the UK. We opened up one in Oldham, which is, I guess, the most devastated, I guess is the word they use here, city in the UK or in England, and we opened up an accelerator there so that people who were from Oldham can also have access to entrepreneurial opportunities, and we would support it in partnership with the government and with other kind of sympathetic partners like Barclays, for example. We also then worked with Sol Campbell, who had read about the startup DNA report that we did, and he said, listen, if it hadn't been for football, who knows where I would have ended up. In his particular case, he has 11 siblings, and he said most of them are still driving trucks and kind of delivery people and things like that. So he said to us, well, I want to make sure that we can also have things like Wyra in places like Harringay and in Tottenham, so that people from those communities, like the ones he grew up, can also express their entrepreneurial ambitions. We're also working with kind of other institutions like the GCHQ that found it really important for us to launch a space in Cheltenham with them, where we have one. And we recently launched a space as well in Milton Keynes. And if we can kind of work out the contracts, we'll open up a space here as well. One of the other things that we did, and this was by speaking to some of the female entrepreneurs in our ecosystem, is I would say to them, okay, we should do another event on gender and stuff like that. And they were like, we're sick of it. We're sick of all the, moaning and stuff like that. So I said, okay, well, what would be different? And what they actually wanted was for us to kind of have events where women were in prominent positions, but without actually saying that that was the reason that we were doing it, so that eventually it would just seem like natural to have a woman as a role model for a man. And so part of what we did then was to kind of make sure that within our mentor base that we recruited all of the most prominent women within the ecosystem, but without saying that we were doing it specifically because they were women or anything like that. The idea was just that there are a lot of really talented women in the ecosystem, and we could leverage their talents as well to help our startups without regard to gender. But we also did use the gender angle as well, because what we found is a lot of the women in tech have their own informal networks. And so if we're trying to recruit startups and women are going to them for mentorship and things like that, we then say to them, so which are the best female entrepreneurs that you know, so that we then know who we should be going after to kind of recruit and invest as future Wyra startups. And I guess the last two slides I have is just kind of like nowadays, I don't even think the kind of pipeline myth and all of those other stereotypes still hold true anymore. This is an article from the FT just a few days ago saying that female hedge funds now outperform those run by men. So no longer the case that women are kind of being held back. And I guess lastly is this idea that what we've seen is by just kind of making ourselves available and open to diversity in this way and speaking openly about it, then new opportunities come to us as well. And this is one that came to us via the European Union, the Duke of York's office, and also various African heads of state, who also said they also want to bring entrepreneurship to their local communities. And so in particular, in this case, we've teamed up with Google and Amazon and lots of other companies and various heads of state in Africa to go there and build entrepreneurial ecosystems there as well, which for us is really kind of not only doing a good thing, but also doing something that could be profitable, since Africa right now has 1.2, that's my timer, 1.2 billion people, which is a market way bigger than the European Union. At the same time, it's expected that it will become 2 billion over the next 5 years. So kind of by working and accepting diversity, we're also creating new opportunities for ourselves. And that's it. Thank you.